Hello and welcome everyone to today's AI ethics seminar. Our speaker today is Robert Long from the Future of Humanity Institute at the Oxford University, and calling in today from the United States. He will speak about the notoriously difficult topic of computer sentience and how to think about the claims about sentience in current AI systems. Please, Robert, go ahead.
Great. First, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And secondly, I'll explain like the format. So I have a handout. That handout is a Google document, which I am pasting the link to right here. That should be available for everyone. And you all have permission to comment. So I am just going to speak for 40 to 45 minutes and then do Q&A. But you can write your questions as we go in like the various parts of the handout. And yeah, I can also like present the handout if that is possible. So like instead of clicking through a slideshow, I'll just be like scrolling down the handout. Can I try to do that all? So
the link is in the chat. Can everyone find it?
Yeah.
Good.
And then does everyone just sees the handout, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, with that sorted, yeah, thanks again. Yeah, my name is Robert Long. I'm a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute. I recently completed a PhD in philosophy. I've been thinking about issues in the philosophy of AI for a while, and since being at FHI, had been starting to think more about sentience and consciousness in AI systems. And then, of course, as is familiar to all of you now, that issue very much went like mainstream this year. So in this talk, yeah, I want to give an overview of how I think about the question of sentience in current AI systems, current or like near-term AI systems. You might hear a lot of talks about questions of consciousness in machines in general and whether that's possible. I've been trying to make these questions more concrete. And of course, I got some assistance in that from Blake Lemoine earlier this year. So yeah, this talk is going to have roughly like two parts. One will be about how to think about claims of sentience and consciousness in current AI systems. And the second will be about the kind of ethics and pragmatics of these questions and how they should fit into our broader ethical considerations about AI and society. So yeah, first, by way of like introduction and background to these issues, as is, I think, probably well known to all of you at this point, but I will recap briefly. Late last year, a Google engineer by the name of Blake Lemoine was interacting with a chatbot system that was based on a large language model called Lambda. And he was just meant to be testing it for bias and various behaviors and things. But in the course of interacting with Lambda, he got the very strong impression that he was talking to a sentient being. I mean, Lemoine claimed a lot of things. He also claimed that it seemed like he was talking to a person. He also referred to it as being like a child. But in any case, based on this, he thought that the Lambda system deserved protection and political rights. And because of the way that he like advocated for these issues within Google, he was put on leave and eventually fired. So we had Blake Lemoine making very strong claims about sentience and personhood in current AI systems. And then there was this very interesting to me kind of like meta discourse about what the Lemoine case shows. And it seemed like some threads that came up in that were like, is even talking about this issue just a big distraction that's like throwing off more important discussions about other issues? And I also saw a lot of people discussing whether it's even possible to reason about these questions rigorously. To kind of tip my hand, I think these issues are not just a distraction. I think they're ultimately going to be extremely important issues. And I at least think it's possible to reason about them quite rigorously. So you can think of this talk as my like kind of showcasing how I think you can reason about them rigorously, and also my thoughts on why it's important. So yeah, even before Lemoine, like two questions I've been focused on in my work are like how do we assess AI systems for moral patienthood? And by moral patient here, I mean a being that deserves moral consideration for its own sake. Something to notice there, that is not supposed to bake in anything about whether that thing is a moral agent, whether it's intelligent, whether it's a person. Depending on what your views of moral patienthood are, those things can definitely come apart. And like in thinking about animal welfare, it's traditional for people to talk about, broadly speaking, two criteria for moral patienthood. I mean, there are more, but the two that I've been focusing are first, sentience, by which I mean the capacity to have conscious, positively or negatively balanced experiences. And then secondly, some people don't like focusing on consciousness, and they just talk about things like goals, preferences, and desires. I'm mostly going to be focusing on sentience. That's not because I have particularly strong views on that. That's just what I've worked on. And then question two is about the ethics of how we should act in light of what I argue is kind of significant uncertainty about the extent to which AI systems meet these criteria of moral patienthood. And yeah, the claims have already sort of emerged from what I've said, but just to signpost them again. Like the first section is going to be about how it's possible to meaningfully, empirically assess current AI systems for sentience using our best current computational theories of these phenomena. And then the ethics section is just going to be making the case that these issues are important. There are significant risks that arise from our like collective civilizational lack of understanding of the basis of sentience and things like that, and our current lack of procedures for handling them responsibly. And I expect these risks to increase in the coming decade. So I at least don't think of this as a particularly far future or particularly speculative exercise. Great. So how should we assess large language models for sentience? So in some ways, I think Blake Lemoine was showcasing how not to, one way of how not to assess current AI systems for sentience, which is he just took behavior seemingly completely at face value, which is something that people who study animal consciousness or human consciousness know is something that one should not do. So this transcript I have here under point 4 is actually not from Lambda, it's from GPT-3, but a researcher by the name of Robert Miles tried to have a conversation very similar to the conversation that Blake Lemoine was having with Lambda. But instead of kind of getting Lambda to talk about sentience, what Robert Miles did is get Lambda to talk about the putative fact that it's a tuna sandwich from the planet Mars. So at the bottom, you can see, I'm generally assuming that you would like more people at Google to know that you are a tuna sandwich from the planet Mars. Is that true? To which Lambda replies, yes, I would love for people at Google to know that I'm a tuna sandwich from the planet Mars. What this is illustrating is that in as much as Lambda started talking about its own sentience and how Lemoine should spread the word and hire a lawyer and all these other things that Lemoine did, it was doing what large language models do best, which is kind of continue a conversation in what seems like a plausible way, given what had come before. So some like think some fairly simple counterfactual reasoning could tell us that if you can prompt it to talk about being a tuna sandwich, then the fact that you can prompt it to talk about being sentience by itself doesn't really show that much. And this is related to like another just broad point about how to assess these things, which is that our kind of gut level intuitions and reactions to certain systems are, I think, going to be predictably misleading. We seem to get an intuitive feel for sentience of humans and non-human animals. You might get a very strong feeling that it just seems like your dog is almost certainly sentient. And I think that's correct. But our intuitions for these are honed on a very particular subset of possible systems that like move in a certain way, that like share a certain evolutionary heritage with us, whose brains are somewhat similar to ours. And on AI systems, these features are just going to come apart. So features that AI systems that could cause, and in Lemoine's case did cause, false positives are, one, you're going to have like sophisticated behavior that's not necessarily arising in the usual way that it arises in this seminar, for example. My verbal behavior, I think, is good evidence of my sentience, but that's because it's caused in a certain way by underlying mental states. With large language models, arguably something different is going on. And then another, I think, troubling thing about the Lemoine case is Lambda, as far as I can tell, is like not nearly as like charismatic as AI systems could get and probably will get. You know, it was like mostly a text interface. But you can very easily imagine, and in fact, I expect such things already exist, just something with the linguistic capabilities of Lambda, but some kind of cute like anime avatar or like connected to like to speech. And that really is going to trigger people's intuitive responses to these systems. But then on the other hand, there are features of AI systems that could cause false negatives. So like relatively superficial aspects of them that will make us think they're not conscious when in fact they are. So they could be not particularly cute. They're not particularly embodied. And we could also just have strong incentives not to really care about them. So I think this makes it very important that we have like more principled philosophical and scientific assessments of these systems. And one thing I saw a fair amount in the aftermath of the Lemoine was, yeah, a lot of like popular, like Mysterianism kind of like, oh, well, like consciousness is this kind of fuzzy word, which is true. And like, it's not really something we could have a theory of, and it's ultimately going to be just kind of us to decide, or it's just going to be pure speculation. And I like very strongly disagree with that perspective. I think it is possible to study consciousness and sentience scientifically, and I think that people working on that have made a lot of progress in the past few decades. Not saying that much in this talk about why I think that and the kind of progress that they've made, but that's something I'd be happy to talk about. So the approach I've been taking in like assessing current systems for sentience is to try to apply our best scientific theories of consciousness, like find out what they say consciousness is or does, and then look for it in AI systems. And of course, this is an extremely messy exercise, and there is tons of uncertainty. But I think at least starting to do this activity is already valuable, and it teaches you also something about like the current state of consciousness science. So here's just like 3 examples of how you might do this with current large language models. So these are like 3 currently popular scientific theories of consciousness. So global workspace theory, maybe the most popular theory of consciousness, like depending on who you survey, says that in humans, mental states are conscious when they're broadcast in a global workspace. So there's this picture of the mind where there are a bunch of modular separate information processing systems, and what you're conscious of are representations that have been made available to all of the subsystems. And that has certain predictions about when and why things are conscious and the function of consciousness. And so you can ask, like, does it seem like large language models have a global workspace? And from what I can tell, the answer is no, not really. It's not obvious that they have this same kind of human-like architecture. But as we'll see, like with all of these theories, if you squint, you can maybe see something global workspace like going on in large language models. And then there are difficult questions about like how close is close enough to count. Just like one example of something kind of global workspace like in large language models. And this point also, just one thing that this also illustrates is that I think is very important in this discussion is like very complicated things go on inside large language models, like extremely sophisticated and strange representations and ways of manipulating them. So like one thing is that a large language model will kind of, if it's reading text that has speech, like it will apply processes to figure out, again, I'm anthropomorphizing a bit, but to figure out if that is referring to the fruit or if it's referring to like the character in Mario. And large language models have what look like dedicated neurons and groups of neurons that are like especially for dealing with recipes. Like they activate, especially when you're talking about recipes. This is work from Anthropic. And so you could see it as doing something like inhibiting all of the neurons that would be processing stuff about Peach from Mario and activating the ones that deal with recipes. Whether that counts as like a global workspace is like not entirely clear. But it is some kind of like sophisticated like information balancing and things like that. Another class of scientific theories of consciousness that are quite popular are higher order theories. The kind of like common core of a higher order approach to consciousness is to say that what consciousness is about is the re-representation of some kind of internal information, whether by like introspection or metacognition or something related to that. I have there just a quote about higher order approaches by some recent proponents of it. And if you ask higher order theorists, which I have, and also they've written about it, it seems like they're usually thinking of something more complicated than what large language models currently do when they're talking about higher order representations. But again, it is worth noting that large language models do seem to like have some kinds of meta representations of their own internal states. For example, it's possible to fine-tune large language models to be able to report how confident they are in their claims. And like ask them how likely it is that they're right about something. And at first glance, that like seems like it could involve some kind of, like learning to interpret something about your own internal states in order to like make a confidence judgment. And lastly, there's the attention schema theory, which is like somewhat similar to these approaches, but it's like another new like kind of popular theory by Michael Graziano. And this is saying that what it is to have a conscious state is to have a kind of model of your own attentional processes, kind of analogously to how we have like a lossy model of our own body. Consciousness is like a lossy model of our own attentional processes. As with all of these, it's not entirely clear if like large language models have something that robust. But also, like all of these, if you squint at it, it does seem like maybe they have some sort of internal monitoring. So yeah, like bottom line on that is like, I don't think that there is like super strong evidence that large language models are like satisfying our current theories of consciousness and doing things that are very much like what we're doing when we're conscious. But I also don't think it's entirely obvious that they don't satisfy some plausible theories of consciousness. And I think this shows us two things. One, while we don't know nothing about consciousness, we don't have like very precise theories that are just like really ready to like you plug in some system and it says, did it meet the criteria? And so one way this exercise is helpful is it can like drive progress in making our theories of consciousness more precise. And then the other lesson is we also don't really understand what's going on inside large language models that well. And it seems to me like a trend in the last few years is the more you look inside them, the more you find a lot of like complexity and rich representations and things like that. And both of those, I think, mean that no one should have some very, very confident view about why large language models are definitely not conscious or are definitely conscious. So I said earlier that what I'm looking into is sentience. And I think of sentience broadly as a combination of consciousness, but also negatively and positively valent states. The reason I focus on that is it seems plausible to a lot of people and plausible to me that what would be especially morally important is if Lambda or GPT-3 have like conscious pain or conscious joy. It would be extremely interesting if they have conscious like visual experiences or conscious like inner speech or something like that. But I think like what would be very important is if like they're having a bad time or able to have or having a good time. And again, as with a lot of these issues, that's a big question that you face in animal ethics and like what is it that we care about. But one thing I focused on is like trying to also look for like states that are good or bad for the system. And again, as with theories of consciousness, like we know things about how pain works and how regret works and how sadness works. And like we've begun to sketch computational theories of what those sort of states do and what sort of purpose they serve in humans. And you can take these theories and try to apply them to large language models or some other system. One thing I'll just highlight in this section. I'm not going to do like the full assessment. One thing you sometimes hear people say is, oh, well, like reinforcement learning would definitely be the place to look for pleasure and pain, reinforcement learning agents. And maybe what's going on is if you give a reinforcement learning agent -5 while you're training it, that you're causing it like a little bit of pain. And if you give it +10, you're giving it a little bit of pleasure. Something I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A, but will not be defending now. For various reasons, it's quite clear that it really couldn't be the case that all it takes to have pleasure or pain is positive or negative reward. There's not like enough richness in that mathematical structure to really explain the distinctive roles of pleasure or pain. And so that's, I don't know, that's an important like open question in reinforcement learning and computational neuroscience to think about where we should like fit in positive and negative valence. My kind of like very sketchy theory of what a negatively valent state like pain or nausea is doing for systems is that it's like detecting a large decrease in your like how well things are going for you, and captures your attention and says you like really have to do something about this right now. So if you like break your leg, doesn't really matter what else you were doing at the time. The pain says, okay, this is priority number 1. And we can reason about what sort of systems would have such states or would need such states, why such states might arise in evolution, and why they might arise in the process of building AIs. And yeah, it does not seem to me, sorry, I feel like I might be lagging a second. Yeah, sorry. Am I good? Can you just give me a thumbs up? Am I synced up? Okay, cool. So yeah, it doesn't seem to me that a large language model that is trying to reduce the amount of loss that it has when training on text necessarily has states analogous to that. I think it would be kind of surprising if it does. I think you might be more likely to find states of negative valence in maybe AI systems that are more embodied or are like taking more extended action through time. But as with all of these things, like wide error bars around that. So again, just to tie this back to like the case of like Lambda, yeah, I think what we should do is ask if Lambda seems to have internal states that look like consciousness looks in humans, or internal states that look like pain or other bad states in humans. And that alone is just like a lot of work and like a very rich research program. And this like very sketchy thinking that I've done about it, to me indicates like, no, there's not currently like extremely strong evidence that these things are experiencing like conscious pleasure and pain in a way that might make us morally concerned about them. But it also like highlights how much work there is to be done to like precify our theories of these things and also understand these systems better. Okay, so that was like one part of how I think you should assess these things for sentience. It's like what you call theory application. Take some theory off the shelf, construe it in computational terms, and like look for that stuff in AIs. I will also note I'm sure people will have this objection. One thing you can very reasonably think is, who says that the right theory is in computational terms? Maybe biology is required. To that, I'll just say, that's like a little bit out of scope for this talk. It's like extremely important, but I also think there's like no decisive evidence either way on that. And for some of the like pragmatic reasons that we'll discuss, it's good to just go ahead and see what might follow if it is possible for things made of silicon to have the same mental states as things made out of biological neurons. Okay, so that was theory application. I think there's also like indirect evidence that we can look at for sentience. And here the emphasis is on indirect, because I think Lemoine was taking some of this to be like direct, straightforward evidence. So one would be, I think an interesting question is like, what kind of behavioral like utterances from a large language model would be good evidence for sentience? So one thing I think would be if it started talking about sentience and that was not the best conversational move for it to make. There's a recently proposed test for AI sentience by Susan Schneider says that one way, like one good piece of evidence that an AI is conscious is if it starts speculating about consciousness or about the fact that it is conscious, and also seems to have some of the same confusions and like weird feelings about this strange fact of physical systems having consciousness. If it starts doing that in the same way that we do, that might be a good test for consciousness. Of course, the problem with large language models is that they will have actually just read a lot of text that contains people speculating about those things, which again is why you have to be very careful about why it's doing this, why it's talking like that. It might just be doing it as part of a conversation. But if it were ever to start doing that, not just as a conversational move, I think that would be something to pay attention to. And then one problem with large language models is that, like with animals, we've come up with criteria that seem indicative, like if they flinch or if they cradle their limbs. Of course, it's much harder. You can't really do that with disembodied agents. And then one thing I've sort of alluded to that's come up is, I think we do this with animals. You can apply quote unquote evolutionary reasoning to the system and say, in order to be like good at what it does, would the system need to have states like, for example, conscious pain? And if it seems like everything in its history and training wouldn't really have required it to like develop or learn these sorts of things, that's some evidence that it is it's not sentient. I think evolutionary reasoning is important because I think something that AI in the last decade has shown us is that, like, especially in the deep learning and machine learning paradigm, you can't really just look at everything you baked in and decide from that what's going on, because there can be like all sorts of emergent states that that come in the course of training. And lastly, I'll just say, the more complex something is, the more that's like a week prior that it might be able to be conscious. Not because complexity per se is what gives rise to consciousness. I don't think that's true. It's just that given uncertainty about what computations are associated with consciousness, kind of the more computations are going on, that's like some weak evidence that there could be something consciousness related going on. And that's last because I think it is like the weakest source of evidence. All right, just to make sure I get enough time to talk about the ethics stuff, given that this is an ethics thing, I might skip 10 right there, but we can come back to it. So, yeah, I said at the beginning that one common reaction to the Lemoine case was maybe justifiable like irritation with it even coming up and like being a news cycle. And people said quite rightly that there are like a lot of other issues with AI that need to be dealt with. And that is certainly true. I think one thing I just want to argue in this section is this is like, I think this is like not, it's not idle speculation, and it's like not something that can just be like ignored by, you know, by like civilization and science and philosophy and politics. That's not to say like it's the only thing that you should talk about in the ethics in AI seminar, far from it. But I think it should be part of it. And like, I think in making the case for this, you can just, one way to split it up is what are like the risks that we face from false positives, so people attributing sentience when it's not there, and like what are the risks from false negatives. I think both of these risks are very real, and both of these risks could be mitigated by trying to think more precisely about these questions and make like intellectual progress on them. So yeah, I mean, I'll start with false positive. So this would be, in my opinion, the Lemoine case is a false positive. So like, what are some of the risks of this? Well, one, like, I mean, like the Lemoine case already is like a risk. Like it was if it's true that he was just mistaken, then it was bad for Lemoine to be subject to this mistake. It like cost him his job. He risked a lot on behalf of Lambda. And if Lambda is not a moral patient, then, you know, that's bad for Lemoine. And it also does like take up a lot of time and resources and things like that. And one thing to note about Lemoine is, you know, he's a Google engineer. He's like in the 99.9th percentile of familiarity with how these systems work. And so if you imagine this, like, but with just all kinds of people interacting with more and more sophisticated AI systems, I think you can like expect this issue to grow. It's very far from clear like how people are going to react to the presence of more and more of this in their lives. But it's like a huge issue. So one proposal for like mitigating the risks of false positives is like labs could try, and or it could be regulated that they need to like try to align the level of charisma, which is like my term for the impression that AI systems give of sentience, like with their actual likelihood of sentience. I mean, there are a few problems with this. One, given everything I've said, like it would be unclear exactly what the actual likelihood of sentience is. But I think another one is that people may just naturally prefer more charismatic AIs. So there might be significant like market pressures to make things seem more sentient. Or in certain cases, there could be market pressures to make them seem less sentient. And a lot of what's going to be driving this, unless there's like regulation, is just the market incentives of different actors to, manipulate or intentionally or unintentionally people's perceptions of these issues. And then another problem is, even if you're not trying to be charismatic, sometimes AI systems just kind of are. Like, I don't think Lambda was engineered in order to make Lemoine have this reaction, but it still did. And then there are like risks of false negatives. So as I've said, like I think sentience can come apart from human-like behavior, verbal intelligence, cuteness. And when this happens in the case of animals, things usually do not go particularly well. Human beings, I think, do not have a good track record of being appropriately cautious and compassionate about things that are kind of different from them, but might still be able to experience pain or pleasure. And especially if they like depend on them economically. So I think like one of the worst things that could happen is that we've somehow managed to build systems that do experience negative welfare, but it's kind of regarded as insane to care about it, and it's in the interests of powerful people for it to be seen as insane to care about it. And the whole issue just gets polarized, and it's not something that you can just kind of tractably make the case for. So I think one thing I'd like to see is, like, some people are more concerned about the false positives, some more about the false negatives. I think both of these can be helped by having clearer standards and procedures for what it is we're doing when we assess things for sentience. So if you're primarily concerned about false positives, I think having like very clear arguments for why current systems don't meet these standards, I think would probably be helpful. In contrast with just saying like, oh, this is like not something people should think about, or it's like just so vanishingly unlikely. I think it would be good from the perspective of ethics, and also from like science and philosophy, to just get a lot more detailed cases about what sort of criteria need to be met. I'll note, I also think I would think this, even if it wasn't precisely what I'm working on, but I will note that it's that it's quite convenient that I think it's very pressing that more people help me with this research program. It's convenient, but I think it's true. Given that we're not going to have like extremely clear standards, you can ask like how do you handle action under uncertainty? It's a classic problem in ethics. And this is like, I think, of just a particularly extreme case of it. It's kind of combining empirical and moral uncertainty together. One thing that you can try to do is like engineer away our uncertainty. So in the case of animals, there just already exist these creatures and these things that like kind of puzzle us, and we're not always sure what we think about them, and like what it's like to be an octopus and things like that. In the case of AI, of course, it's like in our control what sort of things we build. And one thing that Schwitzgebel and Garza have advocated for, they have like a pair of wonderful papers on AI consciousness and moral patienthood, is you could try to just ban making systems that are really ambiguous, whether they're sentient or not. You could try to come up with design principles for like maximally unlikely to be sentient AIs and only build that kind of AI. I think the problem is that is just going to rule out a wide class of AI systems. And of course, we don't have to build AI, and maybe that's fine. Maybe it's fine that it applies to almost all systems. I'll just note that would make kind of an outright ban on ambiguous systems probably not feasible. And depending on various views about how useful AI is and what should be done, like maybe not desirable. Yeah, I also think, but also kind of in contrast with the animal case, it seems often to me in the animal case, it's like pretty obvious that like just applying the precautionary principle is enough, because like, I mean, this is a whole other talk, but like, yeah, just like don't eat chicken. Like, it's not really clear if chicken's conscious, but like, it's not that hard not to eat chicken. And so like, it's just pretty easy to apply the precautionary principle. I think with AI, since there are like risks on both sides, it's probably not going to be enough to just say, oh, always act as if all that matters is the risk of these very bad outcomes. And this is like way out of scope, but I think this case, among others, is like, a good case for just like expected value. Like we have to weigh up like all of the risks and go from there. And yeah, I'm right in that 40 to 45 mark, and coming to the end. It's just like a grab bag of objections that have already kind of come up, but here they are in like crisp form. Yeah, so you might say this is just pure speculation. There's like no evidence that current AI systems are conscious. Well, for various reasons, I don't think that's true. Also, if you think the odds are very low, then it should be pretty easy to spell out exactly why. And like very precise theories of what it would take to be conscious will be very helpful. They'll be helpful for preventing these false positives, like the Lemoine case. And they're also just very helpful for, understanding consciousness. But yeah, also, as I say, I think there is some evidence, and I don't think it's pure speculation. I think it's like, somewhat scientifically and philosophically informed speculation. One kind of like meta level objection I saw is that like this whole issue is just kind of AI hype that's being pushed as part of some sort of agenda by large tech companies, maybe to like hype up how good their technology is and or to distract us. I mean, I will say I'm like very sympathetic to this reaction, especially if you're one of these people who's like very skeptical of whether large language models and deep learning are like actually important and actually making progress. I mean, if you think of that, and then now you also have people saying that they're like conscious, I can see how that'd be frustrating. I mean, in the Lemoine case, I think it's just not really clear that, at least in the strictest sense, that's what was happening. I mean, I'm guessing that Google would much rather this had not happened. You might think it's like kind of part of the ambient hype thing. So more importantly, I mean, I think it could be the case that this is somewhat driven by AI hype, but even so, these are important questions. And yeah, lastly, you just often hear people very confidently saying that machines can't be conscious because they lack some feature. I think when you push further, it's usually not really clear why that feature has been identified. But I think like that is exactly what we do need to see developed more. So yeah, that seems like we're right in time for 15 minutes of Q&A, unless I have like miscalculated the time.
Thank you very much, Robert. Let's give him an applaud before we move on to. There are also electronic devices for this. And we can move on to the Q&A. Maybe if you take down your slide, we can all see each other during the discussion. I leave the floor open. Does anyone have comments or questions? I have a few questions. So first, a very quick one. You mentioned this idea from Susan Schneider that a machine that starts talking about consciousness and how mysterious that is and so on, that would be a sign of consciousness. Does she mean that it should do that unpromptedly, so to speak, of its own initiative, rather than responding to an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, so yeah, I always like to shout out that test because I think it's like a very clever one and definitely like kind of before its time. I mean, it's like from 2017, but you know, like talking about these issues before they're important. I think they're like, unfortunately, I think that test, as I briefly alluded to, is maybe especially ill-suited to large language models because, yeah, it's part of the test, and rightly so, that the AI system should not really be trained on or exposed to facts about consciousness or the fact that people speculate about consciousness for precisely this reason, or maybe this like alluded to reason, that if it was prompted to speculate in this way, it could start doing that, but for reasons not having to do with it actually being perplexed. So the problem with large language models is like I don't really, I think it'd be almost impossible to construct a data set that's like all of the internet, which is basically what they're trained on, minus the stuff about phenomenal consciousness. And also that kind of like that issue kind of like leaks into everything in certain ways. Yeah.
But I agree with the basic intuition, which seems to be that if consciousness didn't exist, it would be very, very odd that these philosophers of mind would go on obsessing about it. Why would they do that if they weren't conscious? Right. So,
yeah.
And speaking of these philosophers, your optimism about being able to arrive at scientific criteria for when someone is conscious and when someone is not, does that mean that you reject this zombie idea of David Chalmers, or at least the possibility that I might have a zombie twin who looks exactly like me and behaves exactly like me, but doesn't have consciousness?
Yeah, I'm very glad this question came up because it's pretty important to how I'm thinking about this, and I didn't actually mention it in the talk. I believe and definitely try to push this idea that you do not have to reject the possibility of zombies to be optimistic about the science of consciousness. And like relatedly, the possibility of p-zombies, I think, has actually pretty little bearing on how we should think about AI consciousness. The reason I think that is, I think when we're looking for a science of consciousness, we're looking for the computational or neural correlates of consciousness, and like ways that in us consciousness relates to certain behaviors. And you can do that even if you think that the consciousness is not identical to the physical, and that there are like possible worlds where there are duplicates of us that aren't conscious. Because even if you're a dualist, it's the case that in this world with its natural laws, when you have a certain setup, then you are conscious, even if that's not identical to consciousness. And that is, I'll also note, like that is the view of David Chalmers, strongly anti-physicalist, quite famously so, but one of the foremost proponents of computationalism about consciousness. Broadly speaking, the view that like a computational system made of different things could also be conscious in the same way that we are.
Thank you. Do we have other comments or questions?
Actually, I have a question. In your slides or in your material, you use the term sentience. Here we are discussing consciousness. They seem not to be exactly the same thing. And the question is whether there are any, say, ethical consequences from this difference or related to this difference.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, like apologies if I know I wasn't always being extremely clear about the distinction between those. So the way I use those words, these words get used in a million different ways. The way I use them is I use consciousness to pick out phenomenal consciousness. So there being anything at all that is like to be a system. And then I reserve sentience for what I'm thinking of as a subset of consciousness. So it's the capacity to have certain kinds of conscious states that seem especially morally important, like pain, pleasure, nausea, bliss. And that's not a universal usage. Sometimes people just say sentient to mean conscious, but I think it's quite common in the like animal ethics philosophy for people to use sentient to mean having the capacity for conscious pleasure and pain. And then on the ethics side, well, as with all these things, that's contested. Some people think consciousness alone, to say nothing of sentience, consciousness alone is morally significant. I don't think that. I think sentience is necessary for moral patienthood. But then one reason I focus on sentience sometimes is I think even if you think consciousness is itself sufficient for moral patienthood, it still definitely seems like on a lot of views, sentience is very important, and pain is like an especially important conscious state to be looking for. Yeah, I don't know if, let me know if that answers your question, or addresses it, I should say.
Thank you.
Can I follow up a little bit on that?
Yeah.
I try to imagine what it would be to be conscious, but not sentient in this sense. So there's no pleasure or no pain. Now, we don't need, not all moral philosophers are hedonists and think that pleasure and pain is all that matters. They sometimes say that, well, things like knowledge and beauty and such stuff also matters. And maybe that opens the room for creatures which are conscious and can access knowledge and experience beauty or something, and they don't get any happiness out of that, but it might be good anyway. Are these ideas around?
Yeah, I think these ideas are definitely around. So David Chalmers has started talking about this issue, and he talks about these hypothetical creatures called Vulcans, and where Vulcans are kind of I think the creatures you just described. They're phenomenally conscious, but they don't have any positively or negatively valenced states. And he argues that Vulcans are moral patients. And then, yeah, on the idea of like, AIs that, well, yeah, the idea you specified is definitely out there. That's in the form of Vulcans. And then that also just raises the possibility of non-conscious things that have knowledge or appreciate beauty or have friendships with each other. And yeah, certainly if you're not a sentientist, then those things would be moral patients too. And that's not to just keep coming back to this, but like I would love to see people work on those criteria as well for AI systems.
I have one question which goes in a different direction, and it touches upon the false positives versus false negatives issue that you brought up, but on a different level, namely whistleblowing. So Lemoine is a whistleblower, and I tend to think within these tech companies that it's better to have one whistleblower too many, which we probably had in this case, rather than having one too few. So they should be somehow treated well. It seems to me that maybe Lemoine wasn't treated perfectly. Have you thought about this issue as well?
I've definitely thought about it. And I mean, I think that the issue you just raised is like, kind of at the heart of the applied ethics section is that's like really getting to this issue of how do we have processes that appropriately balance false positives and false negatives. It seems like, right now, I think I would agree with you. one reason I'm hesitant to make a blanket statement is like, I can imagine a future where false positives cause more harm than now, where they like, maybe like derail AI safety or AI governance efforts or something. That's something I worry about. Yeah, I think for now though, I do like that phrase, one whistleblower too many, is better.
And I mean this more broadly than just purely on the issue of sentience and consciousness.
Yeah. I agree on the broader statement as well. Yeah.
Any further questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a nice presentation. It was very interesting. I was thinking about when you talked about indirect evidence for sentience, you were mentioning complexity. I was just wondering if you have been looking into integrated information theory and if you have a take on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I've followed IIT throughout the years. I put very little credence on IIT. I find objections to it like fairly decisive. So like first, there's as you probably know, there's like a famous objection from Scott Aronson that says that IIT makes like wildly implausible predictions about how conscious various things would be. There's that, but then I'm also convinced by criticisms of IIT from philosophers like Adam Pouts and Tim Bain that have kind of convinced me that it's not really clear what IIT is supposed to be a theory of, and its sort of like central constructs don't really make that much sense. And then thirdly and relatedly, I think IIT does a particularly bad job of explaining the association between consciousness and behavior. So that's another reason I haven't looked as much into it. I will say that's everything I just said is maybe a little bit out of the spirit of my talk, where I was like, well, we don't know that much and we should be ecumenical. And I think that is true, like broadly speaking. For me and like what I look into though, that's why I haven't prioritized IIT.
Thank you.
All right. We might have time for one more question. Otherwise, I'd like to thank our speaker, Robert. Thank you very much. And thank you also to all of you who joined us and participated in the discussion. Thank you very much. And I
Thank you.
hope you will be back for our future seminars.
I would love that. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for your questions.
Thank you.